Lex Friedman is a Russian agent or not. I have watched the Friedman-Zelensky interview several times. I don't know what is wrong with Lex Friedman, but it was an absolutely disaster. He looked completely unprepared for the interview. Or was he really that naive? Could it have been an order from the Kremlin? Let's break down what really went wrong in this podcast. The interview begins with Lex Friedman saying that he's from this region.
I say this as somebody who deeply understands the geopolitical complexity and history of the region. I am from this region. I was born in Tajikistan.
And that he has interacted with many people in Ukraine.
I spoke to hundreds of Ukrainians since 2022, including soldiers, civilians, politicians, artists, religious leaders, journalists, economists, historians, and technologists.
Remember this, it's very important in the context of this podcast, because as it turns out, Lex isn't the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war at all.
It feels like a lot of the time there's a lot of the trying to like buy credit and everything, and it's like, yeah, it feels really stupid.
The first thing Lex starts with is the language issue. This isn't the most interesting part of the podcast, as Lex seems unclear about Zelensky's refusal to conduct interviews in Russian and his stance on addressing Russia audiences.
That everyone will hear this. And yes, Ukrainian language is important symbolically, but what is also important is that we understand each other well.
No, the Ukrainian language is not just symbolically important. If Lex had understood the historical context, he would know how many times the Ukrainian language has been banned, and that for Ukrainians it's a direct way of fighting and cultural separation from Russians. And Zelensky gives a pretty straightforward answer to the question of why he doesn't want to give interviews in Russian.
However, I can't respond in Russian the entire interview. Today, there were 73 missile attacks against us, and people were killed. There were over 100 drones today, and this is a daily occurrence. The people who attack us, they speak Russian. I don't think that you can just pretend that nothing's happening and give Putin a pass once again for saying that we are one people, that we speak one language, etc. They speak the language of weapons. That is a fact. Yes, so it's a very, very important and sensitive moment. The message is that we are not one nation. We are not the same country. We're different countries.
Of course, you cannot remove the fucking context, especially right now when Ukrainian language is prohibited again in occupation. This is not the time. He is a president. Zelensky is a face of a nation that is fighting right now to be Ukraine. When the language thing started to be a problem, it started to be a fucking problem in 1863. Okay, in 1863 was the first law of the prohibition of Ukrainian language by Russian Empire. Preservation of Ukrainian language in Ukrainian identity has been basically the crux, the whole point, the essence, okay, of this entire struggle.
This is why it's so painful to talk about the Russian language too, because they will not listen no matter what language we speak.
However, Lex Friedman remains unconvinced by Zelensky's explanation, but let's move on.
But we still need to talk. What I would want, I do have what some might call a naive dream of you sitting down with Putin and Trump and negotiating a deal about a ceasefire and together finding a path to long-term peace.
Remember this sentence because he will repeat it many times during the interview. Then Zelensky goes on to explain very clearly why ceasefire does not guarantee peace for Ukraine and what Putin's motivation is.
I was definitely well prepared, but he wasn't. No, he was not deeply involved in the process. What about the millions of children over there? What if we just arranged a ceasefire without understanding what would happen next? Without understanding what will happen to Ukraine's security guarantees? What about the millions of children in the occupied territories? What should I tell them? Do you understand what's happening?
So if you want a sustainable peace, you have to have justice. That's his point. You can't just say, let's have a ceasefire. Okay, everybody stop. It's all done. It's not going to work like that.
He lacks here basic human empathy or intelligence.
After Zelensky nearly 40-minute speech about the Minsk agreements, NATO negotiations, guarantees for Ukraine and children in the occupied territories, Lex Friedman asked the following.
Could we talk seriously about guaranteeing Russia's security?
Are you serious? Did you even listen to what you were told? I don't know why he asked that question. Maybe he's naive and doesn't realize how hilarious it sounds.
What are the guarantees for Russia?
How would you like to suck my balls?
I'm even interested what happens to them. To be honest, I don't care what will happen to them in the future after the war ends.
He says, what can you say about guaranteeing Russia's security? Well, this is perhaps the most gratuitous phrase that Lex uttered, the closest he comes to expressing an extreme propagandist point of view. You cannot talk about guaranteeing Russian security unless you explain what the threats to Russian security actually is. This is a straw man argument that was used for invading Ukraine.
After Zelensky's repeated speech about NATO and security guarantees, Lex compliments Zelensky on his English. In general, throughout the podcast, you will get the feeling that Lex Friedman does not follow the dialogue and does not ask clarifying questions.
Preventive measures also work to prevent the aggression of Putin. No, to stop.
Your English is better than my Russian. This is wonderful.
I'm not sure.
I'm just giving you compliments.
Thank you.
You're supposed
Thank
to do
you.
that kind of thing to a president.
Thank you so much.
But that just isn't a very good interview. When you interview someone, you should be asking them thought-provoking questions to get new and interesting information. Every time President Zelensky mentioned anything, Lex Friedman just ignored it and went on to his next stock question that were pretty absurd. Lex ignored that Ukrainian children are being stolen by Russia. Lex ignored Russia's violation of the Budapest Memorandum, the Minsk agreements, bringing North Korea into the war, Russia bombing civilian cities in Ukraine nightly. Russia's not a democracy. The people of Russia have no personal freedoms anymore. Lex ignored how many Russians have been killed or imprisoned in this war or for speaking out against the war. Russia's invasion of Georgia, their occupation of Moldova, their brutality in Chechnya, and Russia's war crimes in Syria and Africa. Plenty of opportunities for Lex Friedman being given this new information to say, can you explain? And he didn't do it a single time. It didn't matter what President Zelensky said to him. Cool? Like,
What happens next? Lex Friedman talks about his dreams again, just like he has all the times before.
I have a dream that on January 25, or sometime at the end of January this year, you will sit down with Donald Trump, with Vladimir Putin, and together negotiate a ceasefire with strict security guarantees, and an agreement will be signed.
Dude, seriously? He just explained to you why ceasefires don't work and that Ukraine needs to have a strong position on the battlefield to come to the negotiating table.
And you still talk to me like that?
After a brief conversation, Lex Friedman talks again about his feelings and dreams. Thank you, Lex.
I have never talked to Vladimir Putin, but I have a feeling that he is ready because Donald Trump is ready. I hope you are ready. And this is not just a feeling, but a dream.
I have a dream here that the three of you will get together in a room and make peace.
I don't know, maybe he just trolling Zelensky, or maybe Lex really doesn't realize that big conflicts like this don't get resolved that easily.
Even you are now talking about ceasefire, just a ceasefire. Maybe give flowers to Putin, maybe to say, thank you so much for these years. That was a great part of my life. No, we are not just ready for this.
The climax of the interview, where it becomes absolutely clear that Lex Friedman is not immersed in the Ukrainian context and the Russian-Ukrainian war in general.
More sanctions. It's okay. Not to take off sanctions.
It's okay with you, but it's not going to be okay with the president of Russia.
Yes, but I'm not thinking how it will be very good for him. He's still a killer.
Unfortunately, the reality is that a compromise is needed in order to reach an agreement.
In your understanding, the fact that he is in jailed after all the murders, he is not in jailed assuming all the murders, and no one in the world is able to put him in his place, send him to prison. Do you think this is a small compromise?
At this point, Zelensky could no longer tolerate his interviewee's naivety and gives brilliant speech. This is significant because Zelensky directly refutes Russia propaganda's claim that Putin is protecting anyone in this war.
You have to look at him as a serious person who loves his country and loves the people in his country. And he conducts, destructive military actions.
Who are you talking about now? Who loves his country?
Putin. Do you think he doesn't love his country?
No. What is his country? He happened to consider Ukraine his country. What is his country? Explain it. No pity for the Chechens? Who are the Chechens? A different people. Another faith, other people, another language, a million. Eliminated. And eliminated how? How did he kill them? With love? Why? I'll explain. You cannot send your people to another land to die, knowing that they will die. The boys he sends are 18 years old. 18 years old. They are children. He sends them. He sent them. Syria. He sent them. Africa. He sent them. Georgia. He sent them. 788,000 killed or wounded Russians. Is that love? What love is this? And for what? Does he love his people?
But I take your point. I once again have a dream that even if there's hate, that you sit down with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and you find a way to peace.
Oh, shit. Here we go again.
Lex Friedman then asked about martial law, elections, and Zelensky's re-election after the war, which echoes Russian propaganda that portrayed Zelensky as a dictator using martial law to maintain his grip on power.
Lex Friedman also asked some pretty standard, predictable questions, one of them being about elections. Why is President Zelensky not leaving office? And it's because Russia is bombing civilian cities every day. You can't have free and fair elections when all of your cities are being bombed, when you don't have electricity, when more than 8 million of your citizens are now refugees in other parts of the world.
As I said, the dream I have is a historic opportunity to make peace, to make lasting peace, soon.
Alright, he's talking about his dreams again. I want you to understand that it's fine to dream of peace, it's fine to want negotiations and a cessation of hostilities. But Lex Friedman's dreams are very reminiscent of the Russia propaganda narrative where everything should be done to freeze the conflict, not to achieve a just peace. That's why Lex Friedman's dreams seem so ridiculous.
War is hell, but let me say again, we must find a path to peace. War is hell. This is both a cliche and, of course, it's true. But the resolution to the war, the resolution is not as simple as Friedman, Trump, and Musk possibly believe, especially when that war is imperialistic and genocidal in character. This is not a disagreement between two sovereign states, but between one that seeks to preserve its liberty and develop its own institutions and a larger neighboring state that seeks to erase them. It assumes that ultimately both sides want peace.
I don't know if Lex Friedman is a Kremlin agent, if he just a useful idiot. I lean towards believing he is not. But in the interview he expresses absolutely naive and childish ideas, which are dangerous not only for Ukraine but for the whole West. Friedman's claims about preparing for the podcast and being immersed in the Russia-Ukrainian conflict appear absurd.
Consuming information and having a political stance are also not the same thing at all. Translating information into oppositional action are not the same thing. Even good information by itself will not change the world nor end the war. Only direct, organized, and principled action can.
It looked like Lex Friedman came in with prepared questions and just voiced them. Dude, this podcast, you can ask clarifying questions and get details. The podcast did not reveal Zelensky and the war from a new side, but maybe for the conservative and MAGA audience, this podcast presented Zelensky as a good speaker and opened their eyes to the Russia propaganda. I am not a big fan of Zelensky, but he clearly outclasses the interviewer in this conversation.
But unfortunately, his choice of themes and the construction of his questions suggest to me that his sources of information are weighted towards podcasts, memes, and conversations within a political and social bubble rather than solid journalism and the writings of professional historians.